Have you ever loved someone so deeply you forgot who you were, only to be left behind when you least expected it? Amara, a nurse who had always given everything to others, was abandoned on her wedding day, alone in a soaked white dress, shivering beneath a cold rain. No one stopped. No one turned back. Until a stranger quietly opened the passenger door and drove her home without asking a single question. But it was his little boy who changed everything. He was the first to call her by a name her heart had long forgotten, and maybe, just maybe, the journey begins exactly where we thought it had ended. The rain had stopped being just rain. It had become a veil, muting every sound, blurring the line between the outside world and the ruins unraveling inside Amara. She stood in the middle of the street as if invisible, and in that moment, she wasn't sure she even existed at all. Her wedding dress clung to her body, soaked and heavy, dragging against the pavement like a wound refusing to let go. She stopped at the edge of the road, not to wait, but because there was no reason left to keep going. Every path led to nothing when the one person you trusted most was the first to vanish when you needed them most. No one came. No one called her name. Not a single glance lingered long enough to notice the pain behind her veil. Maybe, she thought, she simply wasn't worth stopping for anymore. And then, the low hum of an engine behind her. Slow. Patient. A silver-gray car moved through the curtain of rain, its headlights slicing through the fog like quiet searchlights. Amara didn't turn around at first. She was used to cars not stopping. To people always moving on. To moments like this being just another blur in the downpour, but this car didn't pass. It stopped, right in front of her, right when she'd stopped hoping. The door opened gently. No rush, no noise. A man stepped out from behind the wipers, white shirt, gray trousers, his tie loosened like he'd just walked out of a long meeting. No hat, no coat, just a black umbrella in his hand, which he opened. The rain kept falling, but not on her. Amara looked up, her gaze dazed in the dim glow, and saw him standing there, holding the umbrella, asking nothing, searching for nothing, just standing, as if his being there was enough to keep her from falling apart. Julian Hart said nothing. He simply looked at her, a woman in a drenched wedding dress, face pale with cold, eyes clouded with rain. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. He tilted the umbrella a little closer to her, sheltering her more, letting himself get wet instead. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, thick with the weight of things that didn't need to be said. She could have turned away, could have refused, but her legs were too tired, and her eyes had nothing left to resist with. So she stayed, letting that umbrella cover the part of her life that had just collapsed. Julian opened the passenger door. No invitation, just a quiet gesture, as if he wasn't rescuing her, just doing the only right thing in a day gone completely wrong. Amara looked inside. Everything smelled faintly of sandalwood and old coffee, clean and lived in. She wasn't sure she should get in, but she had nowhere else to stand. Her first step onto the car floor was a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The soaked hem of her dress dripped onto the seat, her hair sending tiny rivulets down to her hands folded in her lap. But no one spoke. No one minded. No one judged. Julian circled back to the driver's seat, closed the door. Even the way he sat was quiet, not pressing, not prying. She stared out the window now, fogged with condensation. Streetlights slid past her face in muted strips of light and shadow. He didn't look at her, just switched on the heater. The hum, soft and steady, like the breath of a childhood room you forgot you missed. A sound that makes you feel safe even when you're falling apart. After a while, Amara spoke. Not to him, but to the space around her, to the ache inside her chest. "I don't have anywhere to go." Julian didn't answer right away. Then, as if stating something quietly obvious, he said, "Then come with me, until you figure out where you need to be." She didn't ask why, didn't ask who he was, didn't worry. Because in that moment, she knew those questions, if they mattered, would find their time. Right now, she just needed someone to stop. And he had. Not out of pity, not out of familiarity, but simply because she was human. The car pulled away from the curb. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. But for the first time all day, Amara was no longer wet. She didn't know she had just stepped into the car of a man who had lost everything, and he didn't know that the silent woman now seated beside him had once saved the life of the one he had loved most in the world. All they knew was this. On the day the world turned its back on her, he had stopped. She stepped into his car like someone with nothing left to lose and nothing left to hold on to. The rain was no longer just rain. It had become a veil, muffling all sound, blurring the line between the world outside and the quiet collapse unraveling inside Amara. She stood in the middle of the street as if invisible, and for a moment, she wasn't sure she existed at all. Her wedding dress clung to her like a wound, soaked and heavy, pulling at every step. She stopped at the edge of the curb, not to wait, but because there was nowhere else to go. Every road now led to nothing when the person you trusted most became the first to vanish when you needed them most. No one came. No one called her name. No eyes stayed long enough to see the ache behind the sheer veil. She told herself, maybe I'm no longer someone worth stopping for. And then, the low hum of an engine behind her. Steady, unhurried. A sleek, silver-gray car moved through the rain, headlights cutting a path through the downpour. At first, Amara didn't turn. She was used to cars not stopping, to people moving on, to moments like these being nothing more than passing scenes. But this car didn't pass. It stopped, right in front of her, right when she had stopped expecting anything at all. The passenger door opened softly. No rush, no drama. Through the glass streaked with rain, a man stepped out. White shirt, gray slacks, tie loosened like he'd just left a long meeting. No hat, no coat, just a single black umbrella. And he opened it. The rain kept falling, but not on Amara anymore. She looked up, eyes searching the misty light, and saw him standing there, umbrella in hand, gaze neither questioning nor urgent. He simply stood, as if his being there was enough to keep her from unraveling completely. Julian Hart said nothing. He looked at her, a woman in a drenched wedding dress, face pale, eyes blurred with rain. She didn't explain. He didn't ask. He only tilted, the umbrella slightly more over her, letting the rain soak his own shoulder instead. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was too full for words. She could have refused, could have turned away. But her limbs were heavy, and her gaze too, worn to resist. So she stood, letting that umbrella cover what little remained of her world. Julian opened the passenger door. No invitation. Just a quiet gesture, like he wasn't saving anyone, only doing the one right thing in a day full of wrong. Amara looked into the car. It smelled faintly of sandalwood and old coffee. Everything inside was clean, quiet. She didn't know if she should get in. But she also had nowhere left to stand. The first step onto the car floor was like the release of a breath she'd held far too long. Her sodden dress stained the seat. Her hair dripped onto her hands folded in her lap. But no one said a word. No one minded. No one judged. Julian walked around and slid into the driver's seat. The way he did it, quiet, careful, made it clear. He wasn't here to touch her pain, just to make room for it. She stared out the window, fog rising on the glass. Streetlights streaked across her face, dividing her into bands of shadow and dim gold. He didn't look over, just turned on the heater, soft as a bedroom sigh, the kind of sound that makes you feel safe even as you fall apart. After a while, Amara spoke, not to him, but to herself. "I have nowhere to go." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was barely more than breath. "Then come with me, until you figure out where you need to be." She didn't ask why, didn't ask who he was, didn't worry. In that moment, she knew. The questions would come if they needed to. But for now, she just needed someone to stop. And he had done the one thing no one else did. Not out of pity, not out of history. Just because she was human. The car pulled away from the curb. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped. But for the first time that day, Amara was no longer wet. She didn't know she'd just stepped into the car of a man who had once lost everything. And he didn't know that the woman beside him had once saved the life he held most dear. All they knew was this: on a day the world walked past her, he had stopped, and she stepped into his car like someone with nothing left to lose and nothing left to hold. Henry's laughter still echoed down the narrow hallway as he ran off to his room, clutching the drawing like a treasure finally found. Amara remained where she was, bathed in the soft gold glow of the ceiling light. Julian still sat frozen on the couch, as though unsure where to place his hands in a world that had shifted too fast, too suddenly. She lowered her head, fingers clasped in front of her. Her wedding dress hadn't dried completely, leaving long streaks of water across the dark wood floor. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was necessary. A pause, as if they were both waiting for something unnamed to take shape. "Have you had dinner?" Julian asked, his voice quiet, not overly polite, but gently offering the next door forward. She shook her head. He nodded, rose, removed his coat and hung it by the door, then disappeared into the kitchen. Amara didn't follow. She stood there, taking in the home of a man who had once had a family and now lived with just his son. The house wasn't cold, but neither did it try too hard to be warm. It simply was, like its owner, quiet, doing only what was needed. Nothing more, nothing less. The photos lining the walls offered a small window into the life they'd lived here. A slightly crooked wedding portrait, a blonde woman holding a crawling Henry, a photo of Julian steadying his son's bike, laughing eyes trained on the handlebars even as his hand held tight. Amara didn't linger on any one image, but she saw the space between the frames, those quiet gaps that held the time after someone is gone. "Henry will join us. He's just recovering from another round of treatment," Julian said, returning, with 2 porcelain bowls and a wooden tray holding a pot of steaming soup. He didn't let her lift a thing, just quietly set the table, folded napkins into thirds, the way someone does who once lived with someone who noticed such things. Amara sat down, feeling the give of the seat cushion beneath her, the faint scent of aged oak lingering in the air. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to," Julian added as he placed a glass of water near her hand. She nodded slightly, her eyes catching the neat square of folded cloth beside her plate, and suddenly she remembered. How long had it been since someone prepared a meal for her, not out of obligation, not because it was their job, just prepared it. Henry came bounding back down, clutching a worn stuffed bear, settling into his chair as if Amara belonged there too, as if her presence needed no explanation. "Eat Dad's soup. It's a little salty, but I'm used to it," he said brightly, making Julian chuckle under his breath. Amara lifted the spoon, took a small taste. The soup was warm, gentle, touched with ginger and celery. Not too salty, but there was something tentative in it, an effort. She glanced at Julian. He didn't meet her gaze, only spooned up his own portion in silence. "My sister taught me that one," he said eventually, like a passing note. "She has 3 kids now, cooks better than I do." "It's already a gift that you can cook," Amara replied softly, and was startled by the sound of her own voice. How long had it been since she'd spoken without the purpose of comforting a patient or placating a colleague? Henry finished quickly and asked to go upstairs to finish drawing the curly-haired fairy in the forest. When he left, only the 2 of them remained, and silence stretched out again, easy but full. Julian reached for the water pitcher, his hand hesitating as he noticed the small scrape at Amara's ankle, still damp, edged in dried blood. "You fell?" he asked. She glanced down, nodded. "I ran after the car. Didn't make it." A small sentence, but it carried 1,000 shattered dreams. He didn't respond. He just disappeared into the hallway and returned with a first aid kit, setting it gently on the table. "Let me help." Amara almost refused. But his eyes didn't plead. They weren't pitying. They were simply present, offering. She nodded. His touch was careful but sure as he cleaned the wound. She thought he must be used to small gestures like this. Maybe he'd once done it for his wife. Maybe he'd taught his son how. She didn't ask. She didn't need to know his past. All that mattered was this moment, proof that she wasn't invisible. They ended the meal with hot tea. No more than a few words passed between them. But every movement felt aligned, as if they had long ago learned how to live beside each other in quiet rhythms that needed no explanation. Amara looked around the small kitchen, then down at the neatly folded napkin resting on her lap. "It's not the house that makes you feel safe," she murmured. "It's the way someone shares the silence with you." Julian didn't answer, but when he looked at her, it wasn't just the gaze of a kind man anymore. It was the gaze of someone who had once known what it meant to lose, and now, perhaps, was remembering the quiet grace of what it meant to keep. Henry's laughter had long faded from the hallway. Upstairs, the soft creak of his door had gone still. Downstairs, Amara stood at the living room window, a cooling cup of tea cradled in her hand. The hallway light cast a muted golden glow across the wooden floor, shadows of trees dancing against the walls in the rhythm of the night wind. She'd meant to leave 5 minutes ago, then 10, then 20. Her wedding dress was mostly dry now, but the fabric still clung to her, heavy and stubborn, as if it refused to forget what it had been meant for. Everything here was too warm, and she carried a cold no one had asked to let in. She glanced toward the hallway where Julian had disappeared into the kitchen. Henry was in his room. No one was stopping her, but no one was seeing her out either. She placed the tea gently on the table. Her hand tightened around the small handbag, her only possession now. Inside, a phone, some cash, and a few things she'd thrown in without thinking before the ceremony. She took a step toward the door, and then the glass rattled with a crack of thunder. Rain fell, hard and sudden, as if the sky had finally broken, open with the grief she'd managed to keep sealed since morning. Amara froze. Rain. Again. Rain had drowned her at the altar. Rain had witnessed her being left behind. Rain had hidden her tears in the cold dirt, and now it was blocking the last way out. She turned, intending to return to the sofa, when a small voice called from the stairs. "You're still here, right?" Amara looked up. Henry stood on the third step, in his pajamas, clutching his stuffed bear. His face was blurred behind the curtain of hallway light, but his voice was clear with worry. "I had a dream you disappeared. You were cold. You left without saying anything." Amara stopped. Her hand fell from the bag's handle. Henry walked down, slowly, stopping in the center of the room, eyes wide and searching. "Could you stay, just one night? I don't want you to be wet again." There was no pleading in his voice, just the kind of raw honesty that makes it impossible to turn away. Julian appeared at the end of the hall, a folded blanket in his arms. He said nothing, just walked forward and placed it gently on the back of the sofa, then nodded toward the living room. "If you don't mind." "The sofa's still plenty wide," he said softly, his voice like a quiet knock on a door she thought had closed for good. Amara looked at the blanket, charcoal gray, faded slightly from too many washes. It smelled like old cotton and lavender, familiar, unfamiliar. It waited there, not insisting, not inviting, just present. She set her bag down. Slowly. Julian didn't ask questions. Henry smiled faintly, then padded back upstairs without another word. She stepped forward, lowering herself onto the sofa. Her fingers pulled the blanket over her lap. It was soft, warm, a kind of warmth that didn't rush you. A small armor against a long day. No one spoke. The rain kept falling beyond the windows. The lights dimmed. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full, brimming with everything that didn't need to be said. Amara leaned her head back, eyes drifting toward the glass. The rain was still there. But this time, it didn't feel cold. She whispered, not quite knowing if anyone would hear. "For the first time in so long, someone cared I was here. Not because I mattered, but because I existed, and that was when she stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, but because someone had made room for her, without needing a reason. How long has it been since someone last asked you, 'Have you eaten?' Sometimes the warmest invitation is just a folded blanket waiting on a sofa. Do you remember the last person who kept you from walking out the door just because you were still standing there? Tell me." After dinner, Amara stood by the living room window, a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. The hallway light cast a soft gold onto the wooden floor, shadows of tree branches swaying in the night wind. She'd meant to leave 5 minutes ago. Then 10. Then 20. Her wedding dress had begun to dry, but the fabric still clung to her skin, heavy with the weight of a day that had unraveled. Everything here was too warm, and she had brought in a cold no one had asked for. She glanced toward the hallway, where Julian had disappeared into the kitchen after clearing the table. Henry was already upstairs. No one had asked her to stay. No one had tried to stop her, but no one had said goodbye either. She placed the cup gently on the table. Her fingers closed around the strap of her small purse, the only thing left of her day. Inside, a phone, some crumpled bills, a few odd things she'd shoved in without thinking before the ceremony. She stepped forward, just as the windows rattled with a loud crack of thunder. Then the sky opened again, sudden, unrelenting, as if the heavens themselves had begun to cry all the tears she had buried since morning. Amara froze. Rain. Again. Rain had dragged her down into the worst of this day. It had witnessed her being left at the altar. It had swallowed her tears into the cold dirt. And now it blocked the only exit left. She turned, meaning to return to the sofa, when a small voice called from the stairs. "You're still here, right, Miss Amara?" She looked up. Henry stood on the third step in his pajamas, clutching a stuffed bear. His face was blurred by the dim hallway light, but his voice was clear and full of worry. "I dreamed you disappeared. You were cold. You left without saying anything." She paused. Her hand loosened on the purse strap. Henry stepped down, quiet, stopping in the center of the room, his eyes wide. "Can you stay tonight? I don't want you to be wet again." There was no pleading in his tone. Just a raw, unguarded honesty. The kind that makes it impossible to walk away. Julian appeared in the hallway holding a folded blanket. He didn't say a word. Just set the blanket gently on the back of the sofa and nodded once toward the living room. "If you don't mind, the couch is still yours," he said softly, like a knock on the door she thought had long since shut. Amara looked at the blanket, ash gray, worn soft from years of washing. It smelled faintly of old shirts and quiet evenings, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. It didn't ask, it didn't invite, it simply waited. She set her purse down. Slowly. Julian didn't ask why. Henry smiled, then padded back upstairs. She walked over, easing herself onto the sofa. Her hands drew the blanket across her lap. It was warm, gentle, a fragile armor that held firm. No one spoke after that. The rain hummed outside. The lights in the house dimmed, the room filled with a quiet that wasn't empty, but full of things too deep for words. Amara leaned her head back, eyes drifting to the window. The rain still fell, but this time she didn't feel cold. She whispered, to no one in particular. For the first time in a long time, someone cared that I was here. Not because I mattered, but because I was here, and that was the moment she stayed. Not because there was nowhere left to go, but because someone had made room for her without needing a reason. How long has it been since someone last asked you, "Have you eaten yet?" Sometimes a quiet blanket, left on a couch, is the warmest invitation in the world. Do you remember who last held space for you, just because you were there? Tell me your story. The rain had stopped by morning. Sunlight slipped through the window slats, laying long streaks of gold across the floor like a spilled tablecloth of light. Amara woke on the sofa, the ash-gray blanket still draped across her, the faint scent of warm wood and tea lingering in the corners of the room. No alarm, no phone buzz, no appointments. For the first time in months, maybe years, she woke into a space that wasn't rushing toward something, And strangely, the first feeling wasn't confusion. It was gratitude. She folded the blanket neatly and set it on the sofa, careful to leave no trace. But as she stepped toward the kitchen, she heard Henry's laughter outside. Through the glass door, she saw him crouched beside a bed of damp soil, twirling a small trowel in the sun. Julian stood a few steps back, hands in his pockets, watching his son with that quiet attention he gave everything, present without pressing. Amara opened the door softly and stepped out, no one startled at her presence. Henry waved. "Miss Amara, I planted seeds. Dad said today you'd help me cover them with soil." She smiled, her eyes flicking toward Julian in a gentle ask. He nodded. No words, just enough. Her canvas shoes pressed into the damp grass. Henry handed her a little pouch filled with baby sprouts, tiny tomatoes, mint, a few hopeful peppers. "You and me are planting these. This is our revival garden," he announced. The phrase struck her chest. Revival garden. Like something spoken by someone who had survived a long, unrelenting winter. She knelt beside him, her fingers dipping into the cool, soft earth. The smell of post-rain soil always reminded her of hospitals, not because they were the same, but because they echoed. Suddenly, the image came. The ICU, stark white corridors, the hiss of ventilators, pale overhead light turning every feeling into a frozen hush, and a small, still boy, his frame barely filling the hospital bed, oxygen tubes stretching longer than his limbs. Henry. Back then, he couldn't speak, his eyes barely opened. His heart rate skimmed the line between hope and surrender. Amara hadn't gone home for 3 nights. She'd volunteered for every shift because she couldn't bear to leave the weight of those small, unconscious fingers that had once gripped hers in fevered sleep. She remembered placing her palm on his tiny chest, counting each breath, remembered the sudden squeeze of his fingers around hers, and how she'd cried, silently, in the staff break room afterward. She never told anyone, not a soul. Nurses weren't supposed to carry feelings like that. At least, not where anyone could see. "Miss Amara, your hands are all dirty." Henry's voice brought her back. He held up his own muddy fingers like trophies, grinning. She laughed, settling a young plant into a small hollow in the soil. Her hands trembled slightly as she packed the earth, not from emotion but from a tenderness that caught her off guard. Julian appeared with a watering can. He didn't interrupt, just placed it beside her quietly and stepped back again, watching the two of them tending their garden. Henry dropped to the ground with his chin in his hands. "You know what?" he said. "I think you're like a tomato. Plant, small, red, and strong. Stronger than Dad." She burst into laughter. "And your dad," Henry thought it over. "He's like the shovel. Not pretty, but gets stuff done." Julian let out a rare laugh, soft and unguarded. Amara leaned closer to the ground, patting the soil gently around the roots. "Henry," she asked, her voice low, "do you remember me singing to you when you were sick?" He nodded, his eyes bright. "I didn't hear much, but I remember you sitting there. Your hand was always on my chest. I felt safe." Amara didn't reply. Her hand froze, then moved to rest against her own chest, as if checking that her heart was still there, still beating. Julian remained quiet. She had once believed she was just a passerby in other people's lives, someone who came and went, leaving only faint traces that faded with time. But Henry didn't see her that way. He remembered. He still had the drawing. He called her the curly-haired fairy. And this morning, he wanted to plant a garden with her, a garden of revival. When the last sprout was watered, Henry dashed off to fetch a camera to take photos of day 1 in the garden. Amara stayed seated, wiping sweat from her brow, though the air was still cool. Julian set the watering can down beside her. "Thank you for not turning him away," he said. She looked up at him. "I used to think it was enough to walk through someone's life, do the right thing, and disappear. But maybe, sometimes, one handprint matters more than 1,000 promises." Julian didn't answer, but the way he looked at her had softened. Amara lowered her gaze to her hands, dirty, fingernails lined with soil. But her heart felt a little lighter. She knew then, not all memories hurt. Sometimes they remind us we were there and that we mattered. Late afternoon sunlight slipped across the porch, gliding over leaves and young shoots planted that very morning. The air still carried the scent of damp soil and tender saplings, laced with a soft trace of mint from the plant Henry had watered, down to its final drop. Laughter hadn't quite faded from the air. Henry had dashed inside to grab his colored markers, while Amara remained kneeling by the garden bed, adjusting a clump of shifted soil with her fingertips, delicate like brushing hair from the brow of a sleeping child. Julian stood at the doorway, leaning against the frame, a cup of now-cold coffee in hand. He didn't call out, didn't step forward. He simply watched, from a distance respectful enough not to disturb, yet close enough to notice the quiet unfolding of something that had begun to matter. Sunlight stretched across Amara's shoulder. Her back arched slightly as she moved, her gestures slow, steady, almost like a lullaby with no tune. The simple cotton dress she wore, one he had given her that morning, was now streaked with dirt. But to him, she had never looked more beautiful. Not because of how she looked, but because of how she fit, how she belonged. She didn't know she was being watched, and maybe that's why she was entirely herself. Julian saw it in the little ways, the way Henry turned to her and asked, "Did I plant it wrong?" And how she never rushed to correct him, only answered, "What do you think?" He'd never seen his son this patient, or laugh this much, not in one whole afternoon. Before, when Julian's wife was still alive, Henry had been shy, fever-prone, afraid of the dark. After her death, the boy had gone quiet. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh. Julian used to watch him play alone, feeling like he was peering through a thick glass wall, unsure how to reach through, or whether he even had the right to try. But today, Henry had opened that door for someone else. Amara smiled softly when the boy returned, waving his sketchbook in the air. She tousled his hair, and the two of them sat cross-legged on the porch, drawing their happy mint plant, a name Henry had just invented. Julian saw the boy rest his head on her shoulder, like it was the branch of a tree that would never fall, and Amara didn't move away. Julian stepped back, quietly, out of sight. In the kitchen, he set his cup down in the sink. His hands moved instinctively, rinsing it out even though no one had asked. The sound of water running, the breeze slipping through the window, it all blended into a hush. There were no spreadsheets in his mind now, no market projections, just the memory of a woman's back bent to the earth, and the sound of his son. Laughing at silly names, Julian had long believed his heart was closed, not because grief couldn't heal, but because he feared opening up might mean losing again. Love, for him, had once come with conditions: time, trust, space. But Amara, she didn't take. She simply was. Quietly, like sunlight brushing a shoulder. That evening, as Amara folded dry laundry in the utility room, Julian walked in, meaning to say something, only to stop at the doorway. She didn't see him. Her hands moved with a rhythm that suggested she had done this here before. One hand smoothing fabric, the other folding, slow and precise. Not hesitant, not polite, not performing. And he realized some people don't need to speak to make a house feel like home. When she finally looked up, their eyes met for a moment. Neither of them said a word. There was only that look, deep, unspoken, and soft. A look that didn't ask for labels. That knew something had begun, quiet and rooted, and already real. Before he turned away, Julian nodded slightly and said, half to himself, "I don't know where my feelings are yet, but I know one thing. Henry's never laughed this much." Then he walked out, lightly, like fear had been left behind somewhere at the threshold. A week had passed since that rain-soaked afternoon, when a woman stood in front of a church in a drenched wedding dress, and a man opened his car door without asking a single question. Time in this house didn't make noise. It moved like a small stream through stone, steady, full, and with no need to shout to leave a mark. Amara had begun to grow used to the strange rhythm of this place. Mornings waking to the soft scent of coffee from the kitchen, Henry greeting her with a sleepy smile, and a new drawing. Afternoons watering plants together, baking, laughing over the splash of water when one of them misjudged a pour. But this afternoon the wind felt different. It carried the moisture of a late sun, drifting through the garden in soft gusts. The newly planted beds swayed, their leaves turning, as if listening for something whispered on the air. Amara stood at the kitchen counter, a printed email in her hand. The subject line was plain, unmistakable. Invitation to return. ICU. Shift lead. It was from her old hospital, the place she'd worked for nearly a decade before everything fell apart. The previous head nurse had just retired. They needed someone with grit, with steadiness, with the ability to lead when breath itself was on the line. She read the letter again and again, her grip on the paper tightening with each pass. Every word felt like a knock at a door she had locked for good. Part of her wanted to say yes, not for pride, but for certainty, for something that made sense, that didn't ask her heart to speak. But the other part of her still smelled like soil and mint and the laughter of a boy who once called her family. She folded the letter and tucked it between the pages of an old novel on the shelf, not to hide it, but to give herself a pause, a breath. Julian walked out from the living room, unhurried. He held 2 glasses of water. When he saw her, he paused, then handed one over. He didn't ask what she'd been doing. He didn't ask why her eyes looked lost. He was just there. They stepped out onto the back porch together. The long wooden bench sat flush against the red brick wall. It was the spot where Amara watered plants each morning, and Julian leaned against the post with his coffee. Henry was napping upstairs, worn out from an afternoon of drawing and bounding through the yard. The wind swept gently. A chime near the window stirred with a light, clear tone, like fingers brushing the strings of something tender in the chest. Amara sat first. Julian followed, not too close. The space between them was just wide enough to allow for a conversation, or for silence, to say all it needed to. "Have you ever felt," she began, then paused, "like you were living inside something so temporary you couldn't even give it a name?" Julian didn't answer right away. He set his glass down, fingers laced together, gaze fixed on a piece of sky just beyond the trees. "I used to," he said quietly. "For a long time." Amara nodded faintly. Her hands clutched the glass like it was the only real thing she could still hold on to. "I think I'm afraid this feeling isn't real," she said. "That I'll wake up and everything, Henry, the garden, the meals we share, it'll all just be a stopover." Julian turned toward her, looking fully for the first time. His eyes held no doubt, only a silent plea, not to stop her, but to steady her long enough so she might see herself the way they saw her. "And what if it is a stopover?" he asked. His voice was calm. "A stop can still be the one place where you finally rest, even just for a while." Amara let out a small laugh. "You sound like you're telling me not to leave." He didn't reply. He knew any push now would only send her further away. She turned her head, watching the new tomato plant just starting to bud. The sunlight broke through the leaves and landed on her shoulder like a piece of silk. "Henry called this his revival garden," she murmured. "I don't think kids name things without a reason." Julian nodded. A single leaf fluttered from somewhere above, brushing past her arm and drifting into the yard. She followed it with her eyes, gaze lingering at the edge of the steps. "The hospital wants me back," she said, still not looking at him. "I see you lead, the role I never thought I'd have again." Julian didn't ask, "Will you go?" He didn't say, "I need you to stay." He just sat there, the quiet around them becoming a soft net, catching all the unspoken weight in her chest. "Do you think I should?" she asked, unsure if what she wanted was advice or simply a reason to stay. Julian exhaled slowly. "I think, if this is temporary, it's the only temporary thing that's made you want to stay longer." Amara didn't answer, but when she stood up and stepped back inside, her footsteps were lighter than when she had come out. The letter still rested in that novel on the shelf, silent, like a door marked but unopened. And that evening, instead of opening her laptop to draft a reply, Amara rinsed 2 carrots for Henry's favorite stew. For the first time, not out of politeness, but because she wanted to cook a meal in a house that was slowly becoming less of a stop and more of a home. Time always moves faster when you begin to feel like you belong somewhere. Just yesterday, it seemed to Amara that she was still a stranger, a shadow passing through someone else's home on a rainy afternoon. The quiet, warm meals. The mornings. Making tea for 2. The way Henry rushed down the stairs just to show her a new drawing. Everything had unfolded so gently, she almost forgot it could all disappear. Then, that morning, a letter appeared at the door. No knock, no footsteps. Just the red seal of a law office printed in the corner. Julian came in from the backyard, shoes still dusted with sand. He bent down, picked it up, his eyes flicking to the sender's name, then quietly closed the door. Amara was folding laundry in the living room. When he entered, letter in hand, his face unreadable, but not calm. She looked up. "What is it?" she asked. Julian hesitated, then handed it to her. "It's from my late wife's family." She hadn't expected to be the one opening it, but Julian only nodded. 1 page. Polite. Tidy. Every word typed in Times New Roman, size 12, margins justified, just as any serious letter ought to be. The contents were brief, but enough to still something deep inside her. Julian's former in-laws, who still held major interest in Henry's trust and inheritance, had invoked a clause in the will that within 5 years of their daughter's passing, if Julian invited any woman to live under the same roof without a legal marriage, custody could be reevaluated, and financial support from the trust could be withheld to ensure the most stable living environment for the child. Julian looked at her. I thought, they wouldn't care. I was wrong. Amara said nothing. Her hand released the letter, letting it fall softly onto the coffee table, beside a book Henry had left behind, still marked with an unopened piece of gum. Neither of them spoke for several long moments. Then came the sound of Henry's feet thumping down the stairs, a stuffed bear clutched under one arm. "Miss Amara, look at my drawing," he called, but stopped short when he saw their faces. His gaze darted between them, then landed on the letter. "What's wrong?" he asked, voice smaller now. Amara tried to smile. "Nothing, sweetheart, just one of your dad's work letters." Henry nodded, easily believing, because children believe what adults need them to believe. He turned and padded back upstairs, humming a lullaby under his breath. His song faded as he climbed. Then there were two, and the truth between them. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head bowed for a moment, then a sigh. "I don't want this to be pressure. If you feel like you need to go, don't." Amara cut in, not harshly, but firm. "Don't say the thing we're both not ready to hear." Silence again, this one heavier, closer. She stood, walked to the window. Outside, the sun was still beautiful. The trees stood steady. Henry was likely coloring in a green dinosaur. But something inside her had cracked, not because she feared losing her place, but because she feared being the reason a child might be torn from his home. She turned back, her voice barely more than breath. They didn't see Henry smile. They only saw a woman without a title. Julian closed his eyes. There was no arguing. The lawyers hadn't seen Henry reach for her hand at night, hadn't heard the stories she told him as he fell asleep, hadn't watched the light in his face when he called her the curly-haired fairy. They saw paperwork and clauses. To them, Amara was just a name that didn't belong. A breeze drifted through the window. The edge of the letter lifted and fell again, as if even it wanted to be elsewhere. But Amara remained, not leaving, not yet able to say she'd stay. The letter remained on the table, but in Amara's mind, every word still rang. She hadn't slept, not because she was afraid, but because, for the first time in a very long while, she realized she had become a dangerous variable in someone else's life. The bitter truth was, she had done nothing wrong. She had only stayed, quietly, carefully. Loved a child who once called her by a name reserved only for the most cherished. But to some people, that was all it took to justify taking joy away from the very child they claimed to protect. She had watched Julian by the window, watched Henry draw a picture of the 3-person house. She had seen happiness, real, blooming, but nestled within it was something else too. The slow, growing shadow of uncertainty, like the roots of a young plant being silently strangled. And it was in that stillness, in that knowing, that she understood. She would have to be the one to end it. Not because she didn't want to stay, but because she couldn't stay without asking someone else to pay a price. At dawn, the sky wept lightly, dusting the windows in a film of mist that blurred the warm yellow light inside. Amara sat quietly on the edge of the sofa bed, still wearing the thin sweater Julian had given her 2 nights before. In her lap was an old canvas bag, not large but just enough to carry the things she'd brought with her: a few folded clothes, a small bottle of lavender oil, a notebook, and few creased photographs, items no one would notice missing, but ones she had once kept just for herself, things that could disappear without anyone asking why. Since the letter had been placed back on the table, she and Julian had said little. They'd had dinner. Henry had laughed, told stories from school, but between the bursts of laughter were long silences, careful, fragile silences, the kind you don't touch because you know exactly what's bleeding beneath. Amara looked around the living room, the first place she'd felt safe since everything else had fallen apart. Every corner still held pieces of her: the neatly folded napkins, the tea she once poured, the book she had left marked halfway through. And Henry, the child who once believed in her without needing a reason. She couldn't let him be the one who suffered for her presence. Her hand shook slightly as she pulled the zipper closed. The sound, soft, final, felt like a period in her chest. No one had asked her to leave, but she knew. Sometimes you go not because you aren't wanted, but because you want someone else to stay whole. She scribbled a short note and left it on the coffee table, beside the tiny plant she and Henry had potted together. Her handwriting tilted slightly, hesitant, but clear. You are the first child who ever saw me as someone worth remembering. I will never forget that. She folded it neatly, tucking it beside the green crayon Henry always used. The door to Julian's room creaked open just as she was slipping on her shoes. He stood there, not surprised, as if, somewhere inside, he had known. Their eyes met. No accusations, no anger, only ache. You're really leaving? His voice was barely more than breath. Amara lowered her gaze, fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. If I stay, things could get harder for you. For Henry, I won't be the reason you lose each other. Julian stepped closer, sitting on the edge of the couch, his hand resting lightly on the table. I could fight them. There are lawyers. We have options. No, Julian, she stopped him gently. Her eyes were red, but her voice calm. Some things aren't meant to be handled with clauses. Some things need to stay quiet, so a child can sleep through the night. He didn't argue. She stood, walked to the door, then paused. I've left once before, but this time, I want to go without leaving damage behind. Julian's hand moved halfway, instinctively, but he let it fall. Not because he didn't want to stop her, but because he understood. When someone walks away to protect what they love, you don't get to stop them. Amara opened the door. The early wind drifted in, scented with damp grass and the hush of morning. Henry was still asleep, and she didn't say goodbye. Because sometimes leaving quietly is the only way love stays whole. The door closed behind her. The old canvas bag swayed gently with her steps, and the garden, once filled with laughter, now held only the wind, and a letter no one had read a second time. The house remained quiet, as if it hadn't yet realized what it had just lost. The door had closed behind Amara less than 30 minutes ago, but her scent still lingered in the hallway, a faint trace of soap and mint, the echo of her presence, folded into the pillow on the sofa. Julian sat slumped on the couch, still holding the note she had left behind. The handwriting was steady, slanted, just like the way she'd chosen to leave, quiet, decisive, in a way that spared everyone pain, except herself. He read her words again. "You are the first child who ever saw me as someone worth remembering. I will never forget that." Upstairs, a small sound stirred. Soft footsteps, a door creaking open and closing quickly. Henry was awake. Julian rose, about to go to him, but paused when he saw his son appear at the top of the stairs, clutching his stuffed bear. The boy's face was still puffy with sleep, but his eyes scanned the room with a quiet urgency, searching for something that had always been certain, but now was suddenly, impossibly, gone. "Where's Miss Amara?" The question came immediately. Julian hesitated. For a second he nearly lied, but Henry's eyes that had once stared through fevers and IV poles, that knew how to tell what was real and what was not, wouldn't be softened by easy words. "She had to go away for a little while," Julian said softly. Henry stepped down the stairs slowly, the stuffed bear dragging behind him, its ear worn thin from years of being clutched during long nights. At the bottom step, he stopped, his grip tightening. "Eowry, heard," he said. "She couldn't stay, because she's not your wife, because other people don't want her here." Julian's breath caught. He wasn't sure what hurt more, confirming it, or knowing he couldn't fix the break he saw growing behind his son's eyes. "Henry, you didn't stop her," Henry whispered. "You let her go." "I didn't want to." "Then why did she leave?" The bear slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. But in that room, it echoed like something breaking. Then came the sound. Not loud, not furious. Just a single raw sob spilled from the deepest place in a child's heart. "She said I was her family. She said I was the reason she stayed." Julian rushed forward, gathering Henry into his arms. The boy struggled for a moment, but then collapsed into his shoulder, weeping. Tears streamed down the cheeks of a child who had once beaten death, who had learned to smile after losing a mother, now crying over someone who had left without promising to return. Julian held him tightly, saying nothing. After a while, he looked up, his gaze drifting through the rain-slicked window. The sky was dull with drizzle. The light, thin as breath. "Henry doesn't need a nurse," he whispered, not to Henry, but to himself. "He needs the one who held his hand when he was dying. That person was Amara. No one else." Henry gave a broken hiccup, then buried his face deeper into his father's chest. His small fingers gripped the fabric of Julian's shirt, his tears soaking into the cotton like a quiet plea. "Please don't let me lose again." Julian knew what he had to do, but the part he didn't know was whether he was already too late. Have you ever watched a child lose the one place they thought was safe? Not because someone did wrong, but because no one was brave enough to hold on to what was right. If you've ever regretted what you didn't say, then maybe this moment's your gentle reminder. Cities in early morning always look the same. A hush of mist, hurried footsteps, and everyone with a reason not to stop. Amara sat in silence inside a small cafe tucked behind a tram stop. The canvas bag beside her chair was no longer wet with rain, but inside her a chill remained, the kind no towel could dry. She hadn't gone home, didn't even know where that was anymore. She'd walked out of that house because she believed it was the right thing, to protect Henry, to spare Julian from impossible choices, to not be the reason a child got pulled into grown-up wars. But sitting here, surrounded by strangers, she didn't feel relief. Only the quiet ache of having cut herself loose from something real. She unlocked her phone. The message from Julian still sat there, unopened. Just one line. Henry didn't sleep. He's waiting for you to tell his story. She turned the phone face down. In front of her, the coffee had cooled. She hadn't touched it. The waiter brought more sugar. She thanked him, but didn't add any. Outside the window, morning light spilled across an old billboard. Across the street, a pharmacy sign flickered. She remembered taking Henry to a place. Just like that, during his second week in ICU, he had accidentally swallowed a capsule and panicked, refusing to breathe. She had held his hand for 5 full minutes in that fluorescent-lit shop, her grip firm, her eyes level with his. "I'm not leaving," she told him. "You can cough, you can shake, but I'm staying right here." She'd thought of that moment as a small detail in her life. But for Henry, it had been enough to call her family. The cafe door chimed. An older woman stepped in. Familiar gait, silver hair, a wine-colored coat. Amara recognized her immediately. The former head of the ICU, the one who once called Amara the heart of the night shift. Their eyes met. No need for long introductions. "Lose someone?" the doctor asked after ordering tea. Amara gave a faint smile. "More than one," the woman nodded. "I once lost faith. My husband left for another woman, and I thought maybe I was just the background music. But then a little boy in ICU called me a hero." She looked at Amara, and I remembered my worth was never written into anyone's marriage license. Silence stretched between them, soft and long. Amara asked slowly, "What do you do when a child sees you as home, but the adults won't let you in?" The doctor sipped her tea, then said, almost gently, "Then I show up. Not to ask for permission, but to remind them some people may not be named in a will, but they are etched into memory." That afternoon, Amar returned to Julian's house. Henry ran to her, wrapped himself around her leg. No questions, no hesitation. Julian stood in the hallway, stunned, relief too raw to be hidden. Amara didn't offer long explanations. She only said, "I won't stay if you don't want me to, but if you still need me, then I'll go to them. Not as someone's girlfriend, not as a guest in the Heart Home, but as me." Amara Lewis. The woman who held Henry when he no longer had the strength to call for anyone else. Julian nodded, and the next day, she went. Not cloaked in apologies, not seeking permission. She walked in as the person she'd always been, not written into legal documents, but written into the life of a boy who had once forgotten how to breathe until her hand reminded him he was not alone. The morning sky was still gray, but it wasn't raining. The first chill of autumn crept in quietly, through the grain of the wooden floors, through the beams of light seeping in around the window panes. Julian sat in the kitchen, hands wrapped, around a coffee cup he'd brewed hours ago but hadn't touched. On the table, the same letter, creased now at the corners, but the words just as sharp, just as clear. Footsteps echoed softly from the hallway. Amara appeared in the doorway, her fingers brushing the edge of a dark brown cardigan. Her face was calm, but her eyes carried something different. Not sadness, not hesitation, but decision. "I'm not going to run anymore," she said, her voice as gentle as the morning wind. "If they want a conversation, then I'll give them one." Julian looked up. He had expected her to nod, to let him arrange a place somewhere else. But her words, simple, steady, cut through every what-if he'd twisted through the night. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm not sure what will happen," she replied. "But I'm sure of this. I won't let anyone else decide for me what I'm allowed to keep or who I'm allowed to fight for." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll come with you." Amara shook her head. "They need to hear me, not through you, not with anyone between." The meeting was arranged quickly. A stately federal-style home in Beacon Hill, where legacy lived in every detail, from the antique paintings to the bone china teapot resting like a crown atop the oak table. Amara sat across from two women, Julian's former mother-in-law and his late wife's sister. She didn't glance around, didn't compliment the flowers, didn't look for softness in the setting. She sat straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, and waited. The older woman spoke first. Her voice was soft, but measured, like someone used to controlling outcomes with carefully placed words. "You understand why we sent the letter, don't you?" Amara nodded. "Have nothing personal against you," she continued, "but Henry is all we have left of my daughter, and I can't risk him living in an environment without legal protection." The tea in front of Amara was still steaming. She hadn't touched it. "Do you understand how this could affect the trust? The guardianship?" "I do," Amara said quietly. "And I don't blame you, but I have something I need to say too." The room stilled. The older woman tilted her head, giving permission. "Henry didn't choose me because of who I am. He doesn't care about my resume or what I've lost. He remembers that I held his hand when breathing hurt, that I sang to him when machines filled the room, that I placed my hand on his chest when his heart raced too fast." Her voice didn't tremble, and it didn't demand. It was simply the truth, spoken like a window cracked open after too long. "You're right. I'm not his mother. I'm not a wife. I have no paperwork tying me to him, but I have one thing no clause can give: Henry's trust." The younger woman shifted, her eyes flickering. "Henry once asked me," Amara went on, "if someone stays, not because they have to, but because they want to. Does that count as family?" No one answered, but it was the silence she needed. She rested her hand on the cup of tea, then let go. Not to drink, just to mark the moment. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm not here to claim space. I'm still here because one child, your grandson, called me family." Outside, the wind brushed softly against the hedges lining the porch. The older woman finally set down her tea. Her expression had changed, no longer viewing Amara as a threat, but for the first time, as someone real. "Have you ever lost something?" she asked. Amara nodded, eyes steady. "I lost myself. For years, I lived for everyone else until I couldn't remember who I was anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Henry called me back. No more words were needed. Everything had been said, through silence, through eye contact, through an untouched cup of tea, and the way Amara sat in that room not asking to be allowed in, but no longer willing to step aside. She stood. "I don't expect your approval, but I hope you understand. Some things live beyond what's written into a will." She gave a small nod, then turned and walked out. The door closed behind her, but not because she was retreating. This time, she had chosen to walk out of the role of the woman who leaves and into the one who finally stays. Amara had never thought she'd be afraid to open the door to her own home. But when she slipped the key into the lock, her hand trembled, not from cold, but from the quiet fear of becoming the version of herself she'd once left behind. The woman who lived alone, ate alone, cried alone, and no one knew. No one came. No one saw. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it. No dust, no mess, but everything felt foreign. The scarf she'd once draped over the chair still hung there, but she no longer needed it. The pillow she used to hold every night brought no comfort now. The dried mint jar in the kitchen cabinet still held its brittle leaves, but the scent didn't smell like the garden where she and Henry watered plants side by side. She sat on the floor, leaned her head against the couch, and closed her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe that in a few days, everything would return to how it used to be. She would go back to work, she'd cook something simple for dinner, she'd play jazz and pretend everything was fine. But for the first time in her life, she didn't want things to go back to how they were, because how they were meant being alone. It meant silence so heavy she could hear her own breathing at night. It meant no one stopping her when she felt too tired to stand. And then the doorbell rang. She didn't rush. Maybe it was a delivery, maybe a neighbor. But when it rang again, slow even, like someone waiting, she stood and opened the door. Henry stood there. His hair was a mess. His shoes were muddy. He was slightly out of breath, his eyes wide, his stuffed bear dangling from one hand and in the other, a carefully folded piece of paper. Behind him was Julian, empty-handed. No anger in his face, just a long, searching gaze, as if quietly asking whether the woman before him still had strength left to stand. "You left without saying goodbye," Henry said immediately. "You left me." Amara knelt eye to eye with him. "I didn't want you to get hurt because of me. I thought leaving would hurt less." "But it hurt more," Henry whispered, his eyes shining. "Because you didn't ask what I wanted." The words pierced. Not enough to bleed, but enough to ache. Julian stepped forward. "I didn't come to convince you," he said softly. "I came because Henry said, if I can't choose who I lose, then at least let me choose who stays." Henry held out the drawing. Crayons, uneven strokes, bright colors. The backyard, a tall tomato plant, a short mint bush. 3 figures, clearly holding hands. A boy, a curly-haired woman, a tall man beside her, above them, sunlight. Below, in uneven, hopeful handwriting, "Our home only grows when all 3 are here." Amara broke. Not into tears immediately, but in her throat, where breath caught and couldn't find a way out. "Henry," she gasped. "I didn't think you'd draw me." "I drew you in the middle," he said, almost defiantly. "So no, one could pull you away again." Then he looked up. "You don't have to be my mom. You just have to be there when I wake up, like you were when I couldn't breathe." Julian lowered himself beside them. "You don't need to perform. You don't need to replace anyone. Just be you, because Henry chose you, not for a title but for the safety he feels near you." Amara's voice cracked. "I've never been chosen without having to earn it, prove it, fight for it. I thought I was someone who just passed through, but he drew me staying. No one's ever done that before." Henry wrapped himself around her, arms tight. "You're already home," he whispered. "No paperwork needed." Julian looked at them both, his voice low, certain. And if someday you want a name on a piece of paper, it'll be there. But right now, just stay. Not because we're formal, but because we're alive, and we found each other. The room changed. Not in furniture, not in color, but in presence. Because now they stood before each other, not asking to be kept, but choosing to belong. That night they pinned Henry's drawing to the wall with an old tack. Below it, he added a sticky note in red crayon. Home is where someone waits for you. And for the first time, Amara read something she wanted to believe was written for her. They didn't talk about what came next. She didn't ask how long she could stay. They didn't offer a plan. That night, Henry fell asleep on a floor mat beside the sofa. Julian fumbled with a soup recipe. Amara peeled carrots while Henry colored in his drawing on the fridge and asked, "Do you think homes can move?" She smiled. As long as someone wants to stay together, homes can grow roots anywhere. The drawing stayed up all night, like a welcome sign that no longer needed words. Morning sunlight slipped through the window slats, landing directly on the drawing Henry had taped to the fridge the night before. The light shimmered across the waxy colors, making them seem to breathe, as if the drawing itself was smiling. Amara opened her eyes slowly. In her mind was a silence that felt both familiar and new, like waking in a place she had known for years, but where something unspoken had quietly changed. Something that made this little apartment feel less like a shelter and more like a beginning. She sat up and gently adjusted the blanket draped over Henry, who was still curled on the floor mat beside the sofa. In the kitchen, Julian was pouring coffee into 2 ceramic mugs. He didn't look up, but she knew. He'd heard her footsteps and had poured the second cup long before she stirred. She walked over and accepted the cup without a word. Their fingers brushed. Brief, but warm. No one rushed to speak. The kitchen held its hush, punctuated only by the faint clink of spoon against mug. Henry still slept, his tousled curls glowing gold in the soft light. One small hand clutched his stuffed bear, as if afraid it might drift away in his dreams. Julian took a sip, set his cup down. "Want to go up to the roof?" he asked. Amara raised a brow. "Now," he nodded. "The light's nice, and there's a new mint plant." They climbed to the rooftop, a small square of space behind the apartment, where Amara had once kept a few pots of mint and lavender. Lately, she'd forgotten it existed. After the job loss, after she let go of everything, this place had faded into the background. But today, the air was clean. The light was soft, warm without heat. The wind was gentle. The plants, swaying with no urgency, smelled of wet soil, of green, things of something starting again. Julian knelt beside a small pot, a mint sprout, newly planted. He reached down and undid a thin piece of twine tied loosely around the stalk. His hands worked gently, precisely, as if fastening something just beginning to hold. Amara stood beside him, saying nothing. Her eyes were open. More than usual. When he turned around, he held a ring, made of twine, worn, frayed, but round and whole. "Not a proposal," he said quickly before she could react. "Just a reminder." She looked at him, didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Reminder of what? He placed the ring in her palm. His voice was quiet, steady. That you're not temporary. That you don't need a title to belong in our memories. And that if ever you feel yourself slipping, remember, you held Henry together. And you held me too. Amara looked at the ring. Old rope, but twisted by a hand with purpose. She let out a breath. I used to think the only thing I could offer was care. That I had no right to ask for anything in return. But Henry, and now you've shown me, sometimes, we need to be held too. She extended her hand. No measuring, no ceremony. Julian slid the ring onto the middle finger of her left hand, not official, but truer than most vows she'd heard. We don't need history to legalize this, he said. Henry already did that. She laced her fingers with his. Smiled. Just enough. On that little rooftop, in the morning light, there was a twine ring, a crayon drawing on a fridge, and two people who no longer needed to define what they were. They just needed to live it. True. Enough, slow enough, real enough, that no one would need to ask again. When will you leave? The next morning, sunlight filtered gently through the window slats, falling once more on the crayon drawing Henry had taped to the fridge the night before. The waxy colors caught the light like something alive, like the picture itself was smiling. Amara woke slowly, sensing a difference in the air. It wasn't the lingering feeling of something temporary, something hesitant. No, this was something new growing inside the stillness. Not loud, but certain. Julian had already left for work. Henry was at the kitchen table scribbling carefully over a math problem he'd gotten wrong yesterday. He looked up and beamed when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Amara," she smiled back, warmth blooming quietly in her chest. After a simple breakfast, Henry returned to his online class. Amara sat on the sofa, cradling a warm cup of tea. The drawing still lay on the table, half-folded, its edges worn like the rhythms of their life these past few weeks, simple, imperfect, but real. She opened the picture again. Still the same, the three of them in the garden, Henry in the middle, Amara to the left, Julian to the right, hands held, roots strong, sunlight above. Henry had once asked her, "Do you like how you look in the picture?" And she had answered, "I feel more like myself in that picture than I do in the mirror." This time she stood. No overthinking, just one of those healing gestures. Quiet, but unmistakably bold. She went to the cabinet and pulled out an old photo frame. Wiped off the dust, pressed the drawing inside. Edges frayed, colors smudged, leaving everything exactly as it was. No touching up, no starting over. She walked to the living room wall, the blank one she had always left untouched, waiting for something meaningful enough, and then she hung it. No one asked her to. No one suggested it. She just chose. The nail was tapped in gently. The picture swung slightly, then stilled, like a flag planted, like a quiet declaration, like a beginning. Not because someone else needed proof she had stayed, but because she did. Henry came running from the kitchen, his eyes wide. "You really hung it up?" She nodded. "Looks good here, right?" "So, you're really staying?" Amara looked into his eyes. Clear, hopeful, never demanding. She knelt down to meet him face to face. "I don't know what tomorrow will look like, but today I choose to stay." Henry leapt with joy. "Then I'll make another drawing, with a bigger tree, a bigger house, and I'll add a cat, too." Amara laughed, deep and full. Her laughter filled the room, brushed against the picture on the wall like a breeze. She turned back to look at the frame. For the first time, she saw herself not in a memory, but in something still unfolding. That evening, when Julian came home, he paused in the doorway. He saw the drawing, now framed and centered on the once empty wall. A silent proclamation, no signature needed. He didn't ask who had hung it. He simply smiled, slipped off his coat, and walked into the kitchen, as if stepping into a house that was finally inhabited. Amara poured more tea. This time, she set out a second cup, for herself. She didn't wait for someone else to pour it. She didn't wonder who might come next. Because this time, she had stayed, not because someone asked, not because she was chosen, but because for the first time, she didn't wait to be chosen. She chose. Since the day the drawing had been hung on the wall, time moved differently. Not faster, not slower, just steadier. Clearer. Each morning, Amara woke with a kind of peace that didn't need explaining. Julian started bringing his coffee into the living room instead of drinking it alone. And Henry kept drawing, taping up new pictures all over the apartment like little offerings. Once, Amara asked, "Why don't you ask before you stick them everywhere?" Henry had grinned, gap-toothed, and certain, "Because in our house we don't need permission to hang happiness." She laughed, and something inside her softened, like a stone that had lived too long in her chest had been replaced by light. A week after they'd framed the drawing, a letter arrived from Henry's school, parent-teacher conferences. Julian usually went alone. He had since his wife passed. But this time, after he set the letter on the table, Henry spoke up without hesitation. "Miss Amara's coming too." Amara froze. She had never attended a parent conference. She wasn't someone with the right to sit in chairs meant for mothers and fathers. But Henry didn't wait for a refusal. He tugged Julian's hand and shouted, "Don't forget to help her pick a pretty dress." That afternoon, in the school courtyard, the late sun lit up the rows of oak trees by the gate. Student artwork lined the hallway walls. Rainbows, families, dogs, crayon portraits lopsided but full of love. Amara walked slowly beside Julian, palms damp. Not from nerves, but from the old ache of not belonging. She had seen these women before. Well-pressed dresses, soft perfume, designer handbags slung over easy shoulders. And she, in her soft blue dress, loose curls, carrying only a small satchel and a heart still learning how to stay, felt like she was borrowing someone else's seat. Julian stopped, turned to her. "You okay?" She nodded. "Just feels strange." "It feels right to me," he said. "Right? This is the first time I don't feel like someone's missing." The conference room was a repurposed classroom. Desks pushed into pairs, 2 chairs each, for 2 parents. Julian sat down, then pulled out the chair beside him and motioned for her to take it. She hesitated, then sat. Before she could settle, Henry appeared with his class, there to present their projects. He scanned the room, eyes moving fast, then raised a hand and waved. He didn't call out "Mom" like the others. He just smiled at her, as if to say, "You see me, right?" After the children's presentations, Henry's teacher stood to speak. "I want to share something," she said. "Some of you may have noticed. Henry has changed a lot in the past few weeks. He's more open, more engaged, and most of all, he Smiles more. Heads turned toward their row. The teacher looked at Amara and Julian and smiled softly. I don't know what's happened at home, but I do know. Something's been healed. Amara lowered her gaze. Julian's hand found hers beneath the table and gave a gentle squeeze. Henry raised his own hand. The teacher nodded. He stood, small, unsure, but clear. I don't have two parents like some of my friends, but now I have my dad and Miss Amara. She stayed, so now I have two people. The room stilled, no one clapped, no one laughed, but the way they looked at Amara, not with scrutiny but with recognition, told her everything. The seat next to Julian was no longer empty, no longer someone else's extra. It belonged to her, not through title, but through presence. That evening, when they got home, Henry leapt from the car and raced into the house. Amara followed more slowly. Julian caught her hand before she stepped inside. You know, he said, voice low, I used to think letting someone into your life took a miracle. But maybe. Sometimes it just takes someone who refuses to leave. She looked at him, their fingers still laced. A breeze lifted a strand of her hair. I didn't come because I was invited, she whispered. I stayed. Because I chose to. Julian smiled. They stepped inside, and this time no one stepped. Aside for the other, and the once empty chair. From that day on, it waited for no one. The car rolled quietly through narrow streets, the golden light of a late afternoon scattering across the pavement like spilled honey. After the emotion-filled parent-teacher meeting, a calm had settled over the car, soft and full. Henry sat, in the back seat, clutching a new drawing to his chest, chattering excitedly about school. Amara sat in the front, watching him through the rearview mirror, her gaze quiet, full. The sky began to shift, gray clouds gathering like thoughts she used to push away. Rain was coming. Julian glanced upward, then turned to her. Looks like we're going to get caught in it. Amara nodded. A small chill passed through her chest. Rain always brought memories she tried not to revisit. But this time, she didn't feel alone. Julian was next to her. Henry was singing softly in the back seat. And suddenly, the rain didn't feel like a threat. The first drops fell, soft taps on the windshield, then more. Soon, it was a steady downpour. Julian turned on the wipers, hands steady on the wheel. Henry fell silent, watching the rivulets race each other down the glass. Dad, it's raining, Henry called. Julian smiled. Yep, but we're almost home. The car turned onto the narrow alley that led to Amara's apartment complex. The rain had thickened into a curtain. Julian stopped in front of the gate, engine humming low, and looked at her. Want to wait it out? She nodded, and so the three of them sat, listening to the rain. No one spoke, and yet nothing was missing from the moment. Amara gazed through the window, remembering another rainstorm. A white dress, a cold wind, an empty church, and a door that never opened. But now, in this storm, in this car, she wasn't waiting for anyone. She was home. Julian reached over and took her hand. His palm was warm. You okay? He asked softly. She smiled, tightening her grip. I am. This rain doesn't scare me anymore. From the back seat, Henry leaned forward between them. Miss Amara, are you scared of the rain? She turned and brushed a curl from his forehead. No, not when I've got you and your dad with me." Henry beamed, then leaned back in his seat, humming to the rhythm of the storm. A few minutes later, the rain began to ease. Julian opened the door, grabbed the umbrella, and shielded Amara and Henry as they stepped onto the sidewalk. By the time they reached the porch, the downpour had thinned to a soft whisper. Water dripped gently from the eaves onto the brick. "I'll make us tea," Amara said, brushing a drop from her sleeve. "I'll help," Julian answered. Inside, the kettle sang. The scent of tea, floral and warm, drifted through the apartment, like comfort rediscovered. They gathered around the table, each holding a steaming mug. Henry sipped, eyes wide. Miss Amara makes the best tea." "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, smiling. Julian looked at her over the rim of his cup, his eyes gentle. "Thank you for staying." She smiled back, something quiet and full-blooming in her chest. Then Henry set his mug down, dashed to his desk, and came back with paper and crayons. He drew furiously for a few minutes, then returned with a new picture. "This is us," he said, "in the rain, but everyone's smiling." Amara looked down. 3 figures beneath a cloudburst, drawn with crooked arms and wide mouths. She blinked quickly. Julian rested a hand on her shoulder. "It's beautiful, Henry," he said. "Thank you," Henry beamed. "I love you and Miss Amara." Amara pulled him into her arms. Tears slid down her cheeks. Quiet, steady. Julian leaned in and wrapped both of them in his arms. The rain had passed, but its echo lingered. Not as sadness, but as warmth, as love, as belonging. Amara looked toward the window, where the final drops clung to the glass like punctuation marks. She whispered, "Every storm ends when someone chooses to stay with you through it." The day after the rain, Boston turned cold again. No sun. No rain, just a soft, overcast morning, gray in every direction but no longer the kind of cold that seeped into the bones. Amara woke early, as she had for years in the ICU. She didn't turn on the lights. She simply boiled water for tea, then sat by the window, watching the small mint plant she and Henry had planted in the backyard. Its young leaves were still green, reaching for light even when the sky didn't offer much. Julian had already left for work. Henry was still asleep. The house was quiet, not silent but rested, like someone who'd finally found a place to exhale. She was just about to brew a second pot when the doorbell rang. It startled her. No deliveries were due. No one was expected. She opened the door to find an older man, the neighborhood postal worker, smiling beneath his cap. "Miss Lewis?" he asked. "I have a personal letter. No package." The sender requested it be delivered by hand. Amara nodded, surprised, and took the envelope. Heavy paper, cream-colored. The handwriting slanted and aged, definitely not printed. Her hand froze when she saw the name in the upper left corner, Martha L. Winslow. She closed the door, sat down at the kitchen table. Her tea was still warm, but the letter in her hand felt heavier than its weight. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. "Dear Amara, I've written this by hand because I believe some words are only honest when they arrive a little unsteady. I used to be angry at you, not because you did anything wrong, but because you existed, at a time when my daughter no longer did. Because you stepped into Henry's life, into Julian's world, when I was still learning how to live with the silence she left behind. I thought you came to replace her, to take space, to erase. I didn't see what Henry saw. I didn't hear what Julian didn't say. I looked with grief and listened with judgment, until the other day when I saw Henry in the backyard of a friend's house we were passing. He was drawing another one of his pictures. 3 people, him, Julian, and you. I asked, "Who are you drawing?" He said, "My family. Miss Amara is a fairy, not a mom, but she makes it so I can remember my mom without feeling sad." "Amara," I cried, because I finally understood you hadn't replaced anyone. You had preserved something and made it softer. Thank you for staying even when leaving would have been easier, for being kind even when no one was kind in return. I'm sorry, not because anyone told me I should be, but because I want to be worthy of the love my grandson has found. I hope that one day we might sit together, not because of Julian, not because of Henry, but because we've both lost something and are still learning how to hold what's left. Martha Amara folded the letter. Her hands had stopped shaking. She placed it gently on the table, then poured herself another cup of tea. This time, for her. The letter didn't erase the pain, but it opened something. A door. A possibility. She found an old frame, slid the letter inside, and set it beside Henry's drawing on the shelf. A few minutes later, Henry shuffled into the room, rubbing his eyes. "Miss Amara, anything special happening today?" She pulled him into a hug, warm and whole. "Yes," she said. "Something very special just arrived." "What is it?" She smiled. "When someone who misunderstood you finds the courage to say they're sorry." Henry nodded slowly. "Did you forgive her?" Amara looked at him, eyes soft. "I did. Kindness isn't a victory. It's a quiet strength that changes things deeper than we can see." That morning, the sky was impossibly clear. The kind of still blue that only came after a storm had said its piece. The sun didn't scorch. It simply spilled a honey-colored glow across every rooftop, every garden pot out back. The backyard was still the same small square it had always been. A few mint bushes, a tomato plant, and an old wooden table Julian had once rebuilt from someone else's forgotten furniture. But today, that modest backyard would hold something larger than its size. Henry's birthday, and though no one said it aloud, each of them knew this would be the first birthday that felt real since his mother had passed. Amara was up earlier than usual. She tied her hair back, slipped into a soft linen shirt the color of early morning light, and moved into the kitchen. She was making chocolate cake with strawberry cream. The one Henry once swore was better than anything from a bakery. It didn't need tears. It didn't need superheroes. It just needed to be soft. Just needed enough strawberries for Henry to pick off one by one with solemn joy. Julian was already outside, stringing up little flags Henry had drawn himself. Each triangle had a picture. A house, a garden, 3 people. Always 3. He laid the tablecloth, tied a few balloons to the fence. Not too many, just enough to surprise. Henry didn't wake until nearly 9, a record. He padded out of his room, yawning, then froze at the doorway. "Why does the backyard look like a rainbow?" Julian looked up and smiled. "What would you say if I told you today's backyard is your birthday party?" Henry shrieked. "Really? Mom used to say parties at home were the best kind." Amara stepped outside, carrying the cake, a tea cloth draped gently over it. She placed it on the center of the table and slowly lifted the cloth. Henry stared at the cake. Didn't speak for a moment, like he was recording every detail to remember it forever. "You made this for me?" Amara grinned. "Who else would I make it for? Julian." "If Dad eats it all, I'll be really mad," Henry giggled, then threw his arms around her. There were no guests, no loud music, no dinosaurs or costumed magicians, just 3 chairs. 1 table, 1 cake, cold apple juice, and soft napkins. Henry made his wish out loud. "I wish the 3 of us will always stay together, that no one leaves." Then he blew out the candles. The scent of cocoa and cream mingled with the green smell of post-rain earth. Julian poured drinks. Amara held Henry close as he began to unwrap his gifts. She gave him a set of watercolor paints, the fancy kind, the one he always paused to look at in the bookstore window. Julian gave him a backpack with little cartoon gardeners on it, Henry's beloved garden squad. "So you can carry your tools out back every day," Julian winked. Henry squealed with joy, hugging both gifts. "I'm the happiest person in the world today." After cake, Julian played one of Amara's favorite jazz records. They didn't dance. They didn't need to. They just sat in the soft sun, sometimes clapping along, sometimes silent. And then Henry, like always, pulled out paper and crayons. He drew the 3 of them beneath the awning. Hands joined, a cake in the middle. The garden in bloom behind them. Amara looked at the picture, then at him. "You didn't want to invite any friends today?" Henry shook his head. "I don't need a lot of people, just the ones who love me." Amara turned her face slightly, pretending the sun had gotten in her eyes, but it was just to hide the tears. Julian rested a hand on her shoulder, said nothing. She looked back at him, thankful for giving that little boy a real birthday, and for giving her a seat that no longer had to wait for someone else to fill. As the afternoon wore down, sunlight stretched across the table, where crumbs still lingered and frosting clung to the edges of plates. Amara cleared the dishes. Henry ran inside with his gifts. Julian joined her at the sink. "I didn't know a child's birthday could heal so much," he said. "It doesn't have to be elaborate," she replied. "Just honest. And have the right people." Amara nodded. "Today," she said, "I finally felt like I belong." Julian smiled. "I did too." The early light poured through the sheer curtain, casting soft shadows onto the wooden floor where 3 pairs of shoes sat, lined up neatly by the door. There was something quiet about the moment, something still, but not the kind of quiet that spoke of emptiness. It was the quiet of things having found their place. Amara woke earlier than usual. She moved through the house without turning on the lights, the kind of motion that comes from knowing a space well. In the kitchen, she brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for Julian, one for herself, and warmed a small mug of milk for Henry. The oven still carried the faint sweetness of yesterday's cake, and the lavender sprigs in the tiny vase on the windowsill had dried now, but still released their quiet scent. "Good morning," Julian said as he stepped into the kitchen, hair still tousled from sleep. "Morning," she replied, handing him his coffee. Their eyes met, just a flicker, just long enough to say, "We're here." Still. Together. Henry was the last to arrive, dragging his cartoon slippers across the floor, pillow, line still soft on his cheek. "Miss Amara," he yawned, smiling sleepily. "Will you come to school with me today?" Amara paused, Julian said nothing, just watched her quietly. Henry continued, "Today we have family storytelling. I want you to come too." She didn't answer right away. She looked toward Julian as if asking, "Is this okay?" He didn't nod. He simply turned, opened the shoe cabinet and said, "Then all three of us should go. I'll hold your right hand, Miss Amara your left, just like the 3 candles on your cake." And that, so simple, so light, hit somewhere deep inside Amara. 3 candles, 3 people, a family. On the way to school, they didn't talk much. Julian walked with quiet assurance, Henry practically bounced, and Amara carried something in her chest that was part surrender, part disbelief, and part warmth, like holding the hand of a child long enough to soften your doubts. "Miss Amara," Henry asked, looking up as they crossed the street, "if you were a character in a fairy tale, who would you be?" She smiled. Maybe a fairy godmother." "Nope," he grinned. "You'd be the one who walks the prince to school every day." Julian laughed. So did Amara. But something in her chest cracked just enough to let the sunlight in. The school came into view. Old, familiar, its paint peeling slightly at the corners. But today, to Henry, it looked like a castle. Other parents were arriving, too. Some glanced their way, an older man, a black woman, and a child with curls and bright eyes, walking hand in hand. Some looked curious. Some looked uncertain. But some smiled. Amara felt all of it. She used to fear those looks, but not today. Adults are afraid of being seen, she thought. Children only see love. At the gate, Henry turned and wrapped his arms around both of them. Then he ran inside, shouting. Behind him, "Pick me up later, okay, both of you." Julian watched him go, longer than necessary. "Every time I drop him off," he said softly, "it feels like the first time." Amara stood beside him, her hand not quite letting go. "For me, it is the first time, but it feels like something I've been doing my whole life." They walked back together, sometimes in silence, sometimes talking about small things. They passed a little bookshop. Amara stopped to glance at a display behind the glass. 100 bedtime stories for brave little ones. "Henry finished his old book," she said. Julian smiled. "Let's get it this afternoon." When they arrived home, they both slipped off their shoes. Side by side, 3 pairs now rested near the door. 1 adult pair, 1 smaller, and 1 child's pair with red accents and muddy soles. Amara looked at them, then turned to Julian. "What, are we, Julian?" He didn't answer right away. He just rested his hand on her shoulder. Warm, familiar. "A family," he said, and in that moment the house was full, not with noise, but with presence. If that moment made you smile, follow along. For the next chapter, we tell slow stories, so you have time to feel them. The morning light sifted in like sifted flour, soft and golden, stretching long and gentle across the wooden floor, where 3 pairs of shoes sat, still and slightly damp from the night's rain. Outside, the sky remained cloaked in a sleepy gray, the kind that made the world feel like it hadn't quite finished waking. Amara had risen before anyone else, not out of necessity, but out of something quieter, something like gratitude. She moved through the kitchen, barefoot, careful as though not to disturb the hush that had settled over the house. 2 mugs of coffee were poured, 1 for her, 1 for Julian, and a warm mug of milk waited patiently for Henry. She didn't turn on. Any music didn't fill the silence. She let it breathe. Let it hold her. Julian emerged a little later, hair a tangle, wearing the same soft t-shirt he'd slept in. He smiled when he saw the coffee, took the mug, and brushed his fingers against hers. Brief, familiar. Neither spoke. They didn't need you to. Henry was last, dragging his slippers, cheeks still creased from sleep. His voice, still rasped with dreams, called, "Miss Amara, can you come to school with me again sometime?" She laughed, ruffled his hair. "Only if you promise not to." "Embarrass me?" Henry grinned, wide. "I told the class you're not my mom, but you're still the person I love best." Julian burst into a quiet laugh. Amara didn't correct Henry. She didn't need to, because sometimes children say the thing adults need most to believe. That afternoon, the rain came. Soft at first, like breath on glass, then heavier. It tapped at the roof, whispered down the window panes. But inside, all was warm. Julian had made popcorn. The three of them curled into the sofa like puzzle pieces long misplaced but finally reassembled. Henry in the middle, tucked under both arms, his small head on Amara's shoulder, Amara leaning just slightly into Julian. The lights dimmed, a movie flickering on low. Nobody said much. The popcorn bowl sat half full on the table, forgotten. At some point, Amara realized she was crying, not in sobs, just water, from somewhere deep, from somewhere soft. Henry, half asleep, had stretched, his arm behind her and across Julian's chest, a loose, unconscious embrace, a child's way of saying, "This is mine, this is safe." She didn't wipe her tears. She let them stay. Let herself feel, not for the past, but for this present moment that had asked for nothing in return but her presence. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't a romance. It wasn't even a miracle. It was a couch and a child and a man and a woman who once stood alone in a wedding dress soaked to the bone. Now here, in dry clothes, under a soft throw blanket, she had found the thing that once seemed forever out of reach. She belonged. No grand declarations. No legal documents. No answers to the question, what are we? Only this. A boy's small hand wrapped around her waist. A man breathing slow beside her, the sound of the rain easing into memory. At dawn, Amara rose. Julian and Henry slept still, tucked into the sofa, limbs askew, but hearts steady. She stepped, barefoot, onto the porch, wrapped in a knit sweater, tea in hand. She touched her cheek, where the tears had been. The skin was warm now. No cold, no ache, only something close to peace. To home. To yes. She whispered, not to anyone in particular. Maybe you don't find family, maybe you just stop running from it. The rain outside had not yet stopped, falling softly, like the lingering breath of yesterday refusing to let go. Inside the small apartment, the warm yellow glow of the living room lamp lit the corner of the sofa, where 3 pillows still rested, from the night before. Everything was so quiet, you could hear the soft tick of the clock as the minute hand moved forward. Amara had meant to sleep early, after a day that had left her full and hollow all at once. But less than an hour after turning off the bedroom light, she heard it. Small, broken coughs coming from Henry's room, at first light, then deeper, heavier. Instinct rose faster than thought. She was already out of bed before her mind caught up. The door to Henry's room was ajar. She pushed it open gently, and her chest tightened at the sight. Henry lay curled on his side, his brow slick with fever. He whimpered faintly, gripping the edge of his blanket, his breathing short and uneven. She didn't cry out, didn't panic. She simply moved toward him, laying her hand on his forehead. Hot. She pressed her cheek to his skin, confirming the difference her fingers had already told her. She pulled the thermometer from the drawer beside the bed, flicked it on. While waiting, she eased off his extra layers, cracked the window slightly for air. The screen lit up. 38.7 degrees Celsius. Not dangerous, but enough to steal her sleep for the rest of the night. She found a soft cloth, warmed it with water, and laid it gently across his brow. Every 15 minutes she changed it, and every time she did, she whispered, "I'm here." Not for him to hear, but for herself, to anchor the truth of her presence. The last time she had cared for a child this closely was an ICU night shift just before Tet, 2 years ago. She had performed far more complex interventions since, but she had never felt her heart beat so quietly, so steadily, as it did while she wiped the sweat from this boy's temple. Because this time, it wasn't duty, it was desire. There was no chart to update, no supervising physician, no protocol pressing down on her shoulders, just a feverish child, and a woman who realized she'd long since stepped beyond the role of caretaker. By 3 a.m., Henry's breathing had deepened, though he still coughed now and then, each spasm rattling his small frame. Amara poured warm water into a dinosaur-shaped cup from the glass thermos, the one he always reached for first. She lifted him gently, murmuring, "Sweetheart, try a little water." Henry blinked drowsily. When he saw her, he smiled, weak but real. No questions, no confusion. He simply reached up, wrapped his arms around her neck. "Miss Amara, please, don't go anywhere." Something inside her cracked open, not with pain, but with depth. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay here until you're better." He nodded, head dropping onto her shoulder, cup tilting but not spilling. He drank a little, then slipped back into sleep, his hand still loosely grasping the hem of her nightshirt. Around 4 a.m., Julian appeared in the doorway. He paused there for a long moment, watching only the shape of her in the dim light from the hall, her face turned toward the sleeping child. "Is he okay?" he whispered. Amara nodded. Julian stepped in, careful not to stir the boy, and placed his hand gently on Henry's back. "You don't have to stay up all night." "I'm not tired. Let me take over." Amara shook her head, then said, almost inaudibly, "Go back to sleep. I've spent countless nights awake for strangers. This is the first time. I want to stay up for a child I love." Julian didn't reply. He just placed his hand softly on her shoulder. That touch, wordless, was agreement. Gratitude. A quiet promise that she wouldn't have to carry this alone again. Morning crept in. Henry's fever eased. Damp sweat cooled at the base of his neck. His breaths more even now. Amara remained by his side. She didn't sleep, but she didn't feel the absence of it either. She looked at Henry, then at her own hand resting gently against his brow. And she thought, this time, I'm not a nurse. I'm a mother who never gave birth. The morning after Henry's fever, the sky seemed a little brighter than usual. A tender light fell over the backyard, dew glinting on the leaves as if the long, weary night had never happened. Amara sat at the edge of the bed, the warm cloth in her hand gone cold, her eyes still fixed on Henry's even breathing. He'd just woken, cheeks flushed pink from the fever, but his eyes shone with a quiet, curious light. "Miss Amara, can we do something today?" Henry whispered, his voice still rough around the edges. Amara smoothed his forehead, smiling. "What would you like to do, sweetheart? But something gentle, you're still getting better." Henry sat up with a suddenness that betrayed no trace of illness. "Let's plant a tree, a family tree." Julian, in the kitchen making coffee, chuckled when he heard that. "A family tree? Sounds pretty serious." Henry kicked his legs in the air, defiant. "It's not serious. It's a tree that'll grow with me, and you, and Miss Amara. Every year, a little more." Julian came in with 3 warm mugs. He set a cup of ginger tea in front of Amara like it was second nature. "That's a good idea," he said, nodding, to his son. "We'll plant it, right after breakfast." Amara looked at the two of them, her eyes shining, not from fatigue, but from something harder to name. She gave a small nod, and deep inside something whispered, "I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." After breakfast, the 3 of them stepped out into the yard. In the far corner, where new grass had begun to rise after the rain, Henry pointed and declared, "Right here, there's sun, but not too much. There's water, but not flooding, just like when I sleep next to you." Amara laughed. Julian glanced at her and murmured, "The kid knows his spot." They dug together. Amara crouched low, mud streaking her hands, not minding. Julian worked the shovel deep into the earth, then let Henry scoop the smaller patches. The tree was a young red maple, bought 2 months ago from a nursery but never planted. "This one will turn a brilliant red in the fall," Julian explained, brushing dirt from Henry's shoulder. "Like Miss Amara's cheeks when I tell her." "Her cookies are yummy?" Henry asked, giggling. Amara froze for a moment, then smiled and nodded. "Yes, red like my cheeks." When the tree stood firm in the earth, Julian quietly pulled a small roll of fabric from his jacket pocket. It was the same soft ribbon he'd once tied around a makeshift ring he'd given Amara, not as a promise of marriage but of presence. He knelt and tied the ribbon gently around the slender trunk, right below the first branch. Amara stood still, watching. "What's that for?" Henry asked. Julian answered, though his gaze never left Amara. "It's a promise to raise this tree together, like raising a family." Henry nodded solemnly, as if he understood everything. Amara bowed her head and placed her palm gently against the fresh roots. The 3 of them sat on the old wooden bench, facing the garden corner. Amara told Henry stories of the plants she used to tend as a child. Julian shared the time he and his ex-wife bought a houseplant and forgot to water it until it shriveled into a twig. Henry invented a tale about their family tree, learning to talk, retelling their memories to anyone who dared abandon it. "That's why we have to take care of it," Henry concluded. "If the tree dries up, it means we forgot to love each other." Amara turned and placed her hand on Henry's. Julian followed, covering both with his own. One large hand, one medium, one small. Above them, the clouds were pulling apart. Below, the ribbon around the young trunk fluttered gently in the breeze, like a silent vow. That afternoon, Amara made peppermint tea from leaves they'd picked in the yard. She stood at the window, watching the new maple basking in sunlight. Each leaf felt like a milestone. A new day, a quiet choice. Julian came up beside her. "Thank you," he said, "for saying yes this morning." She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was barely more than a hum, like a lullaby only she could hear. A tree doesn't need an iron fence to stand strong, just someone who stays past a single autumn. Julian nodded. And sometimes love is just holding a tree steady for someone else. Late sunlight slanted through the window, catching the watercolor painting perched on the edge of the living room table. The sun was sinking fast, but the picture glowed, almost as if it knew this was its moment to be seen. Amara stood still, eyes resting on the frame. It was one of Henry's wild, unsteady creations. Bold colors, crooked lines. 3 figures, a brown-haired man, a dark-skinned woman with her unmistakable curls, and a little boy between them, holding both their hands. Behind them stood the young tree they'd planted. Above, a wide yellow sun radiated crayon beams across a soft blue sky. What Amara saw wasn't her reflection, but her place. Not behind, not on the edge, but in the middle, held tightly, drawn even before the sun. She lifted the painting carefully and searched for a spot on the living room wall. A blank patch she had once thought she'd fill with real art, if ever she had a reason to stay. Today, she didn't need a reason. She had people, and a choice that no longer required proving. Julian entered quietly, holding a small picture hook. "I think it belongs here," he said, pointing to the center of the wall. Amara nodded. "Right in the middle. No measuring, no fuss." They hung the picture together. When her hand slipped from the frame, it swayed just slightly, then settled, like an exhale. Julian stepped back beside her. "For the first time," he said softly, "this house feels complete." Amara didn't respond right away. She gazed at the picture, something stirring beneath her ribs, but it wasn't pain. It was the softness of someone finally breathing steady in a place that had turned into home. "Used to think," she said at last, "I was meant to pass through other people's lives like a passenger." Julian turned to her. "But now I know. Some places don't need invitations. You just belong." He took her hand, said nothing. Henry burst in from the yard, feet muddy, eyes wide. He stopped short when he saw the painting on the wall. "Whoa, it looks awesome!" he shouted, running over. Julian stepped forward, instinctively trying to stop him from stamping prints on the carpet, but Amara held out a hand. "Let him," she said. "It's home." Henry stood beneath the painting, looking up for a long moment. "You know," he said, "I made the tree really tall, so that even when we're old, it'll still be taller than us." Amara knelt, wiping the sweat from his brow. "And why did you put me in the middle?" she asked. "Because," he said simply, "if you're in the middle, no one gets left out." His words pierced something old and buried inside her. Amara pulled him into her arms. She didn't speak, just held him tight, as if that embrace was the only thing strong enough to keep her from breaking open. Julian knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both. And the 3 of them sat there, beneath the painting, in a quiet afternoon that asked nothing of them but to remain. Later, when Henry had gone to wash up and change, Amara stepped out to the backyard. The young maple caught the last strands of golden light, its leaves trembling softly. She didn't touch it, just stood nearby, breathing. letting something long held begin to dissolve, bit by bit, in the hush of early evening. Julian joined, her standing a step behind. "I've been meaning to say this," he said, "but I think now I don't have to." Amara turned. "What is it?" "That I need you." She smiled. "I already knew." They didn't kiss, didn't speak again. They just stood there. Two people who had lived long enough to understand. Showing up, for real, is the truest kind of vow. That night, Henry taped a small sign below the painting. In his careful, crooked handwriting, it read, "Our home." Amara placed a framed letter beside it, a handwritten apology from Julian's mother. She no longer saw it as proof of forgiveness, just a piece of the story she hadn't just stepped into, but had helped rewrite. And later that night, when the house was still and quiet, Amara sat on the sofa, cradling a warm mug of tea, her eyes drifting toward the painting. No words. Just a thought ringing clear in the quiet of her chest. Some things you give away do find their way back, right when you need them most. Thank you for walking through this story with me. If you saw yourself in even one quiet moment, feel free to share. And if you'd like to follow more stories of healing, stay close. Because sometimes, all it takes is a story to remember. You were never alone.